The cowboy's hand tightened around her wrist the moment the wolves started circling in the dark. Snow blasted sideways through the pine trees as Clara stumbled off the trail, her boots sinking deep into ice. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a wolf growled low enough to rattle the horses. Wyatt pulled her hard against his chest, rifle aimed into the storm. Then he whispered near her ear, "Be quiet and stay close to me." But the look on his face made Clara realize the danger wasn't only outside in the woods. What would you do if you were standing there in that storm? "This evening, you'll go to the station and meet your wife." Evelyn Mercer said it, without looking up from the ledger book in front of her. The scratching sound of her pencil filled the small general store, while wind rattled the front windows hard enough to shake the hanging lantern. Wyatt Mercer stood near the stove, snow melting slowly from the shoulders of his coat. One gloved hand rested on a sack of flour he had carried down from Cedar Ridge that morning. His beard was thick with frost. His gray eyes stayed fixed on the fire. "I never asked for one," he muttered. "That stopped mattering 3 letters ago." Evelyn finally lifted her gaze. Widowhood had sharpened her face over the years, but not softened her stubbornness. She closed the ledger and pushed her spectacles higher on her nose. "She left Cheyenne 4 days ago. You think a decent woman rides all the way to Wyoming Territory in winter for amusement?" Wyatt said nothing. Outside, Red Hollow looked half buried already. Snow packed itself against the boardwalks. Horses stood steaming near the hitching posts. Somewhere farther down Main Street, a hammer struck metal from the blacksmith shop. "You spend too many nights alone up there," Evelyn continued. "A man starts talking more to the wind than people. The wind listens better. That supposed to be funny?" Wyatt pulled his hat lower and headed for the door before she could answer herself. By the time he reached the station, the afternoon sky had turned the color of cold iron. Smoke drifted from the waiting train tracks. A few townsfolk lingered under the awning, stomping boots against frozen boards. They stared when they saw Wyatt Mercer, the mountain hermit, the widower's brother. The man who only came down from Cedar Ridge when supplies ran low or winter threatened to bury him alive. Wyatt ignored them all. Then the train whistle sounded. Steam rolled across the platform as the engine groaned to a stop. Doors opened. Passengers stepped down into the bitter Wyoming wind one after another. A ranch hand with a broken suitcase. An old preacher clutching his Bible beneath his coat. A nervous couple carrying a sleeping child. Wyatt almost convinced himself Evelyn had made some mistake. Then he saw her. She stepped down carefully, one gloved hand holding the rail beside the train door. Her coat was dark brown wool, worn pale at the sleeves from travel. Snowflakes clung to the loose strands of black hair near her cheek, but it was her eyes that stopped him. Green, sharp, and steady, not frightened, not uncertain. The station grew quieter. Clara Bennett adjusted the strap of a weathered leather satchel and looked directly at him like she had known exactly which man was Wyatt Mercer before he even moved. A murmur passed through the crowd. Wyatt heard pieces of it. "She's colored. That's the Mercer fellow? Lord above." Clara seemed to hear it too. She simply kept walking. When she stopped in front of him, neither spoke for a moment. Steam drifted between them from the engine behind her. "You're Wyatt Mercer," she said finally. Her voice carried calmness, but not softness. Wyatt nodded once. "You came alone?" "Yes." Another silence stretched. Then Clara gave the smallest glance toward the mountains beyond town. "So that's where I'm headed. Not nervous, not hopeful either. Just tired." Wyatt reached for her satchel out of habit more than courtesy. Clara held on to it a second longer before letting go. "It's heavier than it looks," she said. "I noticed." He led her toward the wagon, without another word. Behind them, whispers followed like loose paper in the wind. The road up Cedar Ridge grew worse after sunset. Snow had started again by the time they left Red Hollow behind. Pine trees crowded both sides of the narrow trail. Ice glazed the wagon ruts silver beneath moonlight. Clara sat wrapped tightly in her coat beside him, one hand gripping the edge of the seat whenever the wagon lurched over frozen ground. Wyatt kept his attention on the horses, You always this quiet? Clara asked, after nearly an hour. Yes, that's your way of warning me. He glanced sideways. You can still turn back when we reach town again. I didn't ride 800 miles to quit in the dark. Something about the answer stayed with him. The wind rose harder as they climbed higher. Snow swept sideways across the trail. Then suddenly the left wagon wheel slid too close to the edge. The horses jerked. Clara lost balance instantly. Wyatt caught her before she pitched sideways into the darkness below. One rough arm locked around her waist. Her shoulder struck hard against his chest. The wagon rocked dangerously before settling again. For one breath, neither moved. He could feel how cold her hands were even through the gloves. Clara looked up first, close enough now for him to see the exhaustion beneath her sharp eyes. You can let go, she said quietly. Wyatt released her at once and tightened the reins. Neither mentioned it again. By the time they reached the cabin, night had swallowed Cedar Ridge whole. The house stood alone beneath towering pines. Smoke drifted from the chimney into the storm-dark sky. Snow covered the roof thick as wool. Wyatt pushed open the door. Warm firelight spilled across rough plank floors. Deer pelts hung near the stone hearth. Rifles lined the wall above a narrow table scarred with years of knife marks. Everything smelled faintly of cedar smoke, leather, and black coffee. Clara stepped inside slowly. Her boots creaked softly against the floorboards. Wyatt set her satchel near the hearth while she looked around the cabin without speaking. At the back of the room hung a faded canvas curtain separating the single bed from the rest of the house. No curtains on the windows, no flowers, no softness anywhere, only survival. The fire cracked loudly between them. Then Clara spoke at last. A man can sleep here. Her eyes moved across the empty walls. But no one can live here. Wyatt removed his gloves slowly. Usually words like that would have angered him. Tonight they only stayed with him. Clara moved closer to the fire, rubbing warmth back into her hands. Firelight softened the weariness in her face, but not the strength. Wyatt found himself watching her longer than he intended. Outside, wind pushed hard against the cabin walls. Inside, for the first time in years, the silence felt different. And long after Clara disappeared behind the curtain to sleep, Wyatt Mercer lay awake beside the dying fire, staring at the ceiling beams above him, listening to the sound of another person breathing beneath his roof. Morning came gray and cold. Wind pushed snow against the cabin windows while pale light crept across the floorboards. Wyatt woke to a smell he did not recognize at first. Butter, coffee, something frying on the stove. He pushed himself upright from the blanket near the hearth and stopped. Clara stood beside the iron stove in a faded blue dress with her sleeves rolled to the elbows. Steam curled around her as she flipped cakes in a cast-iron pan. Her dark hair was pinned loosely now, a few strands falling near her cheek, and his coffee tin sat on the wrong shelf. Wyatt stared at it. For 8 years it had stayed beside the salt sack near the window. Now it rested beside the stove. Clara glanced over her shoulder without surprise. You keep reaching too far for it, she said. Makes no sense having coffee clear across the room. Wyatt rubbed one rough hand over his jaw. It was fine where it was. It still works from this shelf too. The answer came calm and easy, that somehow bothered him more. He stood and crossed the room slowly, boots creaking against the floor. The cabin looked different already. A blanket had been folded neatly over the chair near the fire. His dirty plates from the night before were gone. The window above the table stood cracked open an inch despite the cold, letting fresh air push out the heavy smell of smoke. Wyatt poured coffee into a tin cup. It tasted smoother than usual. He hated noticing that. Clara set a plate in front of him. Fried cakes, eggs, a strip of salt pork crisped at the edges. You cook every morning like this? He asked. If there's flour enough. You don't have to. No, Clara said quietly. I suppose I don't. That shut him up faster than he expected. They ate mostly in silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one carried movement beneath it, small sounds. Her spoon against the plate, the wind outside, the soft crackle of the stove. Wyatt finished first and reached for his coat. I'll be checking fence lines before the next storm rolls in. Clara nodded once. Then, just as he reached the door, she said, I'll need to go into town tomorrow. He turned halfway back. For what? Curtains, lamp oil, maybe fabric. This cabin's got windows and light already. It has holes covered with glass and one lantern that smells like burnt grease. Wyatt frowned. It worked fine before. Clara met his eyes steadily across the table. You keep saying before, like you expect this place to stay exactly the same. Neither looked away. Finally, Wyatt pulled open the door and stepped out into the snow. The cold hit hard enough to sting his lungs. Still, halfway to the stable, he caught himself glancing back toward the cabin window. Clara stood inside, moving around the kitchen. Small motions, straightening things, bringing warmth where there hadn't been any. It unsettled him worse than loneliness ever had. The next afternoon they rode down into Red Hollow together, beneath a low sky, heavy with snow. Clara wore the same brown coat from Cheyenne, with a dark wool scarf wrapped close around her throat. Wyatt drove the wagon in silence while townsfolk stared openly when they rolled past the church and stopped near Miller's General Goods. Conversations slowed as they entered. The old shop smelled of tobacco, kerosene, and wool blankets damp from winter weather. Mrs. Miller greeted Wyatt first. Then her eyes shifted toward Clara. Polite smile, careful distance. Afternoon, she said. Clara returned the greeting evenly and moved toward the fabric shelves. Wyatt noticed how people watched her without pretending not to. Two ranch hands near the stove lowered their voices. A woman near the counter whispered something behind her glove. Then the front door opened. Harland Crow stepped inside, shaking snow from his hat. Tall, broad, expensive coat lined with fur, the kind of man who smiled without warmth. Well now, Harland said. Mercer finally came down from the mountain. Wyatt's jaw tightened instantly. Harland's eyes slid toward Clara. This must be the lady from Kansas. Cheyenne? Clara corrected calmly. Harland smiled wider. My mistake. Something in the way he said it made the room colder. He leaned one elbow against the counter. Funny thing about small towns, he said lightly. Stories travel quicker than trains. Wyatt stepped between them before Clara answered. We're here for supplies. Harland looked amused, didn't say otherwise. But as Wyatt walked toward the register, he caught the glance Harland gave Clara. Not curiosity, recognition. And that troubled him more than he wanted to admit. By the time they left town, snow had started falling hard again. Pine branches bent low beneath the wind as the wagon climbed back toward Cedar Ridge. Darkness settled early beneath the trees. Then, somewhere high along the ridge came the sound. A wolf. Long. Hollow. Close enough to raise the horses' heads. Clara stiffened beside him. Another howl answered deeper in the woods. The horses jerked nervously. Easy, Wyatt muttered, tightening the reins. Snow swept sideways across the trail now, thick enough to blur the road ahead. Then suddenly Clara slipped while climbing down to clear a fallen branch from the wheel. Her boot lost traction on the ice. She disappeared sideways into the drifting snow. Clara! Wyatt jumped down instantly. Another wolf call echoed through the trees. Closer this time, he found her half hidden beside the wagon, struggling to stand against the wind. Without thinking, Wyatt grabbed her arm and pulled her hard against his chest, one hand reaching automatically for the rifle slung behind the seat. Be quiet, he said low, eyes searching the dark timber. And stay close to me. Clara's breathing shook once against his coat, but for the first time since arriving on Cedar Ridge, she did not pull away. Wyatt kept the rifle raised toward the dark timber beyond the trail. Snow blew hard across his face, sharp as thrown sand. Somewhere between the trees, another low howl rolled through the mountain. Closer now. The horses stamped nervously beside the wagon. Move, Wyatt said quietly. His hand stayed firm against Clara's back as he guided her toward the seat. She climbed in without argument this time, fingers tight around the wool blanket beside her. The rest of the ride passed beneath heavy silence. Only when the cabin finally appeared, through the storm, did Wyatt feel his shoulders loosen. Inside, warmth rushed over them the moment the door shut. Clara removed her gloves slowly. flexing stiff fingers near the fire. Snow melted from the edge of her dark hair onto the floorboards. Wyatt hung the rifle beside the door. "You all right?" he asked before he could stop himself. Clara glanced at him in surprise, like she hadn't expected concern from him at all. "I've been colder," she answered softly. He nodded once and crouched beside the stove to add wood. Behind him, he heard her moving quietly through the cabin. Tin cups, folded fabric, the soft scrape of a chair against the floor. Strange how quickly another person's movements could settle into a place. That night, the storm worsened. Wind slammed the cabin walls hard enough to rattle the lantern hanging near the window. Snow buried the porch knee-deep before midnight. Wyatt slept lightly near the fire, one boot still on, like always during bad weather. Then came pounding at the door. Not wind, a fist, fast, desperate. Wyatt reached for the rifle instantly and pulled open the door. A man stumbled inside, half covered in snow. Ben Turner, the shepherd from the North Ridge. His face looked gray beneath the frost. "It's Eli," he gasped. "He's gone." Clara was already awake behind the curtain. "What happened?" she asked. Ben dragged shaking hands through wet hair. "He went looking for one of the sheep before dark. Didn't come back." His voice cracked. "I found tracks near Miller's Lake. Ice gave way out there earlier this week." Wyatt swore under his breath. Outside, the storm screamed across Cedar Ridge. "We'll never see 10 feet ahead," he said. "But the boy's still out there," Clara answered. She was already reaching for the worn leather satchel she kept beside the bed. Wyatt stared at her. "You know what this weather can do?" "Yes, and you're still going." Clara met his eyes while wrapping a scarf around her throat. A child freezing alone doesn't stop freezing because the weather's inconvenient. No drama in the words, just truth. 10 minutes later, they rode into the storm. Snow lashed sideways through the pine trees. Wyatt rode ahead with the lantern, while Clara followed close beside Ben Turner. Ice cracked beneath the horses' hooves near the edge of Miller's Lake. "Tracks!" Ben shouted suddenly. Small boot prints disappeared toward the frozen shoreline. Then Wyatt spotted something dark half buried beside the reeds. The boy. Eli Turner lay curled against the snow-covered bank, one arm partly frozen into the slush where the ice had broken beneath him. Clara dropped to her knees beside him instantly. "He's alive," she said. "Barely." Wyatt lifted the child carefully into his arms. Eli's body felt terrifyingly light beneath the soaked coat. The ride back nearly blinded them all. By the time they reached the Turner cabin, Wyatt's gloves had frozen stiff around the reins. Inside, Clara took command without hesitation. "More firewood, boil water, warm blankets, not too fast." Her voice stayed calm while fear shook the room around her. Wyatt fed logs into the stove until sweat dampened his collar despite the cold. He sat with Eli wrapped against his chest while Clara pressed warm cloths against the boy's hands and feet. Hours crawled by. Wind howled outside. The cabin smelled of wet wool, smoke, and the sharp herbs Clara crushed between her fingers. At one point, Eli stopped shivering completely. Ben Turner broke apart beside the table. But Clara leaned close to the child, one hand steady against his cheek. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Come on now." Wyatt watched her face in the firelight. Focused, tired, gentle in a way he had not expected. Near dawn, Eli finally coughed weakly and turned his head beneath the blankets. The room breathed again. Ben Turner covered his face with both hands. "Thank God." Clara sat back slowly, exhaustion showing for the first time in her eyes. "He'll live," she said. When they finally rode home after sunrise, neither Wyatt nor Clara spoke much. The storm had passed. Fresh snow covered Cedar Ridge untouched and bright beneath pale morning light. Back at the cabin, Clara nearly fell asleep, pulling off her coat. Wyatt took it gently from her hands and hung it beside the fire. "You should rest," he said. She tried answering, but only nodded faintly instead. A few minutes later, Wyatt found her asleep at the table, one cheek resting against folded arms beside an untouched cup of coffee. For a long moment he simply stood there, looking at her. Then, carefully, awkwardly, he lifted her into his arms. Clara stirred once against his chest, but did not wake. He carried her behind the curtain and laid her carefully across the bed. Her hair had loosened completely now. Dark strands spread across the pillow. Wyatt pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders. Then Clara's eyes opened. For one still moment, neither moved. His hand remained near her face. Her breath touched his jaw. The space between them narrowed slowly, naturally, like neither one meant for it to happen. Wyatt leaned closer. Then heavy pounding exploded against the cabin door. Both jerked apart instantly. Wyatt cursed softly and strode toward the front room, opening the door hard enough for cold air to rush inside. Harland Crow stood on the porch beneath the morning snow. His eyes moved once toward the bed curtain behind Wyatt, then back again. "You should ask your wife," Harland said evenly. "How many men died around her before she came here?" The wind pushed snow through the open doorway between them. Wyatt's hand tightened against the edge of the door. Harland brushed snow from his coat sleeve, like he had come only to discuss weather and cattle prices. "Heard some interesting things from a freight driver out of Kansas City," he continued. "Funny how stories travel." Behind the curtain, the cabin stayed silent. Too silent. Wyatt finally spoke. "You done talking?" Harland smiled faintly. "Just thought a man ought to know who he invited into his home." "My home ain't your concern." For the first time, something colder slipped into Harland's eyes. "No," he said quietly, "but Red Hollow is." Then he stepped off the porch and disappeared into the falling snow. Wyatt shut the door hard enough to rattle the lantern. For a long moment he stood there, staring at the wood grain beneath his hand. The fire cracked softly behind him. He turned at last. Clara stood beside the table now, one hand resting near the coffee cup she had never finished. Her face had gone pale with exhaustion, but her eyes stayed steady. "You can ask," she said. Wyatt looked at her. He wanted to. The question sat there between them, thick as smoke. But something in her expression stopped him. Not fear, not guilt, weariness, the kind a person carried too long. Instead, Wyatt crossed the room, picked up another log, and fed it into the fire. "I'm not asking anything tonight," he muttered. Clara lowered her eyes slightly. That hurt worse somehow. The next 2 days passed beneath a strange quiet. Snow buried Cedar Ridge deep enough to swallow fence posts. Wyatt spent hours outside clearing paths to the barn, while Clara stayed near the stove, mending blankets and boiling herbs that filled the cabin with sharp, earthy smells. Sometimes he caught her watching him through the window. Sometimes she caught him doing the same. Neither spoke much, but something had shifted. The almost kiss lingered between them now, alongside Harland's words. On the third night, the storm eased enough for moonlight to reach the valley again. Wyatt returned from the stable carrying frozen firewood against his shoulder and stopped when he saw Clara sitting alone beside the hearth. No sewing in her hands tonight, no book, only silence. She looked smaller somehow in the dim light. Without turning toward him, she said quietly, "His name was Walter Grayson." Wyatt set the wood down slowly. Clara kept her eyes on the fire. He owned a ranch outside Abilene. Big place, white fences, peach trees near the creek. Her fingers tightened together in her lap. "I worked there caring for his wife after she took sick. The cabin stayed still except for the low hiss of burning pine. After she died," Clara continued, "Mr. Grayson started drinking heavier, gambling too. By winter, he'd lost more money than he could repay." Wyatt sat down across from her without interrupting. One morning, they found him dead in his office. She swallowed once, self-inflicted. Outside, wind brushed softly across the roof. "The town needed someone to blame," Clara said, "and I was there." At last, she looked up at him. "You know how people stare when they've already decided who you are?" she asked quietly. Wyatt did know. Maybe not in the same way, but enough. Clara's voice grew softer. "I lost my room at the boarding house first, then my work." Folks stopped speaking when I walked past. A faint, bitter smile crossed her mouth. "One woman told me death followed wherever I stayed." Wyatt stared into the fire. Harland's words echoed back now, sounding uglier than before. "I read your sister's letter 3 weeks later," Clara said. "I answered because Wyoming sounded far enough away that maybe nobody there would know my name." Silence settled again. Not empty this time, heavy, real. Finally, Wyatt rubbed one rough hand across his beard. You should've told me. Clara nodded once. I know. But you didn't kill anybody. No. Then Harlan Crow can go to hell. The words came out harsher than he intended. For the first time that night, Clara's shoulders loosened slightly. But by morning, Red Hollow was already talking. Harland had made sure of it. 3 men refused Wyatt at the trading post that afternoon. Another stopped speaking when Clara entered Miller's store for flour. By evening, whispers followed them openly through town. The cursed woman. Bad luck. Death around her. Wyatt heard every bit of it, and so did Clara. That night she barely touched supper. After midnight, Wyatt woke to the sound of quiet movement. He sat up instantly. Clara stood near the door, wearing her coat and gloves. Her satchel rested beside her boots. Snow swirled outside through the cracks around the frame. You leaving? Wyatt asked roughly. Clara froze. For a moment she said nothing. Then, it'll get worse if I stay. Wyatt stood slowly from beside the fire. The town already hated me before you got here. This is different. No, he said. It ain't. Clara's eyes glistened in the lantern light, though she held herself steady. You don't deserve this because of me. Wyatt crossed the room before she could reach the door. Outside, wind slammed against the cabin walls. Inside, neither seems able to breathe right. Finally, Wyatt spoke again, voice lower now. Don't leave this mountain. Clara looked at him then. Really looked. And Wyatt felt every wall inside himself splitting apart. He swallowed hard. Don't leave me alone again. The words hung there between them, raw and unfinished. Clara's mouth trembled once. Then suddenly tears slipped down her face faster than she could hide them. Not loud crying, not dramatic. Just years of hurt finally breaking loose in the quiet of a snowbound cabin. Wyatt stood helpless for one long second before carefully taking her satchel from her hand and setting it back beside the table. Clara didn't stop him. And when she finally leaned against his chest, trembling from more than cold, Wyatt wrapped both arms around her, like he was afraid the storm outside might still steal her away. The fire burned low behind them. For a long time, neither spoke. Wyatt could feel the slow, unsteady rhythm of her breathing against his shirt. One of Clara's hands rested lightly against his coat, uncertain at first, then holding on tighter little by little. Outside, wind swept across Cedar Ridge. Inside, something quieter settled between them. By morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight spilled across the snow in blinding silver streaks. Smoke curled steady from the cabin chimney, while Wyatt stood outside near the corral breaking ice from the water trough with the back of an axe. The world looked different after a hard storm. Cleaner, somehow. Clara opened the cabin door carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. She stepped carefully through the snow toward him, her boots sinking deep with each step. You forgot breakfast, she said. Wyatt took the cup from her gloved hand. I was busy. You've been busy since sunrise. He glanced sideways at her. You keeping track now? Someone has to. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, but closer than she had ever seen. Clara noticed it. She pretended not to. The days after that settled into a rhythm neither of them spoke about out loud. Wyatt repaired fence posts, damaged by winter winds, while Clara patched old blankets and sorted dried herbs across the kitchen table. Some evenings, she read aloud from an old newspaper Evelyn had sent up from town wrapped around coffee beans. Sometimes Wyatt listened. Sometimes he only sat near the fire sharpening tools while her voice filled the cabin softly. Either way, the silence no longer felt empty. One afternoon, they rode into Red Hollow together with a wagon full of pelts tied beneath canvas sheets. People still stared, but differently now. Ben Turner shook Wyatt's hand outside the feed store and thanked Clara again for saving Eli. Mrs. Miller slipped an extra loaf of bread into Clara's parcel without charging for it. Not everyone changed. Harland Crow watched from across the muddy street near the church, dark coat buttoned against the wind. You're making a mistake standing beside her, he said quietly as Wyatt passed. Wyatt stopped. Snowmelt dripped from the roofline beside them. For years, most men in Red Hollow had avoided looking Wyatt Mercer directly in the eye. Harlan did not. She belongs here as much as I do, Wyatt answered. Harland gave a short, humorless laugh. That mountain's not worth much now. Wyatt stepped closer, then stopped trying to buy it. For a second, the street went still around them. Then Wyatt turned away first and climbed back into the wagon beside Clara. Neither spoke until Red Hollow disappeared behind them. Only then did Clara glance toward him. You didn't have to do that. Yes, Wyatt said simply. I did. The wind lifted strands of her hair loose beneath her hat. Clara looked down at her gloved hands after that, though Wyatt noticed the faint color warming her cheeks despite the cold. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Cedar Ridge. Snow shrank back from the fence lines first. Then patches of grass appeared beneath the pines. The creek behind the cabin broke apart with loud cracking sounds each afternoon beneath the warmer sun. Life returned little by little. So did laughter. One evening, Clara burned biscuits badly enough to smoke the whole cabin. Wyatt opened both windows while she stood near the stove, fanning smoke with a towel and muttering under her breath. You trying to poison me? He asked. Clara stared at him. Then unexpectedly, Wyatt laughed. A rough, rusty sound like something unused too long. It startled both of them. Clara leaned against the table, laughing too, before she could stop herself. Later that night, they sat close together beneath one wool blanket near the fire while rain tapped softly against the roof instead of snow. Clara rested her head against Wyatt's shoulder. Neither seemed in a hurry to move. You still think nobody can live here? Wyatt asked quietly. Clara smiled against his coat. No, she whispered. I think somebody just forgot how. By early spring, people from neighboring ranches started riding up Cedar Ridge asking for Clara's help, with fevers, burns, coughs, and broken fingers. She never turned anyone away. Wyatt watched her move through the cabin with calm, steady hands and realized the place no longer belonged only to him. And strangely, he no longer wanted it to. One cold morning near the end of March, Clara stood alone on the porch after Wyatt rode out to check the lower pasture. She pressed one hand lightly against her stomach. Still, thinking. When Wyatt returned near dusk, he found her sitting quietly by the fire with tears shining in her eyes. Fear hit him instantly. What happened? Clara looked up slowly. For a second, she seemed almost unsure how to say it. Then a small, trembling smile reached her mouth. We're having a baby. Everything inside Wyatt Mercer went completely still. The room, the fire, even the wind outside. He lowered himself slowly into the chair across from her without taking his eyes off her face. A baby, he repeated quietly. Clara nodded once. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Then finally, Wyatt stood, crossed the room, and knelt beside her chair. His rough hand covered hers carefully, almost afraid too much pressure might break something fragile. He pressed his forehead lightly against her knuckles, and Clara understood then. This silent mountain man, who once feared loving anyone, now feared losing them more than death itself. Months later, spring spread green across Cedar Ridge. Grass rolled soft. Through the valley below the cabin, horses grazed near the creek, while sunlight warmed the porch steps where winter snow had once buried everything in white silence. Wyatt stood beside the fence, holding his infant son against his chest beneath a small wool blanket. The baby slept peacefully. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Clara stepped outside carrying the patchwork quilt she had sewn during the long winter nights. Wind lifted her dark hair softly around her face. Wyatt looked toward the cabin. Once it had held only smoke, loneliness, and a man waiting for nothing. Now there was coffee brewing inside. Laughter. Tiny socks drying near the stove. A woman waiting for him at supper. A family. He glanced down at the child in his arms before looking back toward the mountain horizon, glowing gold beneath the setting sun. Guess this mountain finally sounds alive, he murmured. And for the first time in many years, Cedar Ridge no longer felt lonely at all. Maybe that's why this story stays with people long after the fire burns low. Because deep down, most folks know what it feels like to carry silence around too long. To build walls so high that even kindness starts to feel unfamiliar. Wyatt thought loneliness kept a man safe. Clara thought Running far enough could bury the pain people left on her shoulders. But somewhere between the winter storms, the coffee cups, the long, quiet nights, and two people learning to trust again, they found something neither one expected. Not perfection, just someone willing to stay. And maybe that's what healing really looks like sometimes. Not grand speeches, not miracles. Just a hand reaching for yours in the cold and refusing to let go. If you had been standing on that mountain, if you had spent years believing nobody would ever choose you, would you have opened the cabin door too? Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if stories like this still mean something to you, stories about second chances, worn-out hearts, and people finding home in each other when they least expect it, then stay close a while longer. There are plenty more waiting just beyond the next trail.